Welcome to the Mixology Talk Podcast, where we serve up answers for your cocktail questions, interview top industry professionals, and keep you up to date with what's going on in the world of craft cocktails.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Mixology Talk Podcast. This is our last episode in the Spirit series, and I hope that you're finding this information helpful and kind of breaking down a lot of the flavor ideas of spirits.
So in this episode, we're talking about a type of spirit that tends to spend a lot of time in barrels.
And one of my favorite spirits.
Which is saying a lot because he loves them all.
I do. They're like children.
They're like children. You don't have a favorite. That's a lie. He's got favorites.
Yeah, I do.
Actually, more like he's got least favorites.
That's true, yeah.
Poor little rum. Of course, anyway, the one that we haven't talked about yet is whiskey. You've probably already guessed. So in this conversation, we're going to touch upon bourbon and briefly Scotch as well. But since you don't normally use Scotch in cocktails, we're going to skip over that for the most part, and we're going to be mostly talking about whiskey and bourbon.
Absolutely. So throughout the entire series of talking about spirits, we kind of generalize a lot. So with whiskey, you're basically making beer, and then you're distilling beer. So the basics of how it's made is you steep grain in hot water to, convert some of the carbohydrates into sugars, and then that sugary kind of liquid is what you ferment into beer. And then once you have the alcohol that's present in beer, all you have to do is separate the water from the alcohol, and all of a sudden you have whiskey.
Right, but I do believe there is another step, though, because most, if not all, whiskeys do spend some time in the barrel, correct?
Yeah, and there is a new movement over the last few years where you start to see a lot of clear whiskeys.
Really?
Mm-hmm. So
is that what's called white whiskey?
White whiskey or white dog, or yeah. So essentially what's happening with that is the fact that we have this big movement of craft cocktails and new distilleries opening throughout the entire country. And in order for them to turn a profit quickly, they look to whiskeys or spirits that don't require a lot of aging.
So I think what you're telling me is white whiskey is the whiskey equivalent of that whipped cream cheese where they put less stuff in the actual container but charge you more?
Kind of like that.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Exactly. So basically it's the vodka of the whiskey world. So
does it actually retain some of that whiskey flavor, though? I mean, how does it compare in taste, like a white whiskey versus a vodka or something else?
Yeah, there's a lot more flavor as far as a white whiskey as compared to a vodka. They don't go to the upper limits of vodka distillation. Because
vodka can be made with grain as well, right?
Absolutely.
But vodka will be distilled to a much higher level, removing more of that grain flavor.
Typically, yes.
Got
absolutely.
it. And so with your whiskeys, you're going to retain a lot more of that flavor because I think there are actually upper limits to how high you can distill.
In some of the styles of whiskey, okay. Absolutely. Like bourbon, you can't exceed, I believe it's 80%. So, but not all whiskeys are like that. But for the most part,
not all of them have rules.
High quality whiskey, it wants to retain a lot of the flavor of the wheat.
And I would imagine that if you produced a whiskey that tasted like vodka, the consumers would be kind of bummed. I would. Yeah,
and there's a few of them out there. So
definitely good to know.
So that's essentially how whiskey is made. It's just distilled beer. Now, there are many different types of whiskey out there. Whiskey is a very, very broad category, and within that category, you have really specific styles in there as well. So, like with brandy, you have cognac, you have Armagnac, a few other styles inside of the category, the bigger category of brandy. Whiskey is that kind of catch-all category. So within whiskey, you have bourbon, you have rye, you have single malt Scotch, and there's a couple other designations too, but we won't really get into them because they don't really pertain. You really kind of have to go out of your way to find them. Yeah,
and there are styles as well, right? Because I think recently I've been hearing a lot about Japanese whiskey. I know that Canadian whiskey is a thing too.
Absolutely.
They're not their own genres, but they are sort of regional styles of whiskey
right.
as well.
And you have Irish whiskey, and there's many different styles of whiskey out there for sure. But what we're going to be focusing on is kind of the big players in the craft cocktail movement now, and that's going to be bourbon, rye, and we're going to briefly touch upon single malt scotches. So with bourbon, The only thing that you need to be classified as bourbon, there's quite a few laws, but for a general guideline, it has to be 51% corn, and it has to be aged in new charred oak barrels, and it has to be produced in the United States. One of the misconceptions about bourbon is that it has to be produced in Bourbon County, but that's not the case. It has to be produced within the United States.
Did that used to be the rule, Bourbon County?
You know, it's one of those kind of lores that have been out there, and I don't know the exact answer.
Well, if anybody out there does know the answer, please let us know. You can actually find this episode on the web at mixologytalk.com/6. So head on over there and let us know in the comments, because that'd be really good to know.
Yeah, and it's one of those, the alcohol industry is filled with all these misconceptions.
Rumors and lore.
Right, exactly. So to know the concrete facts would definitely be helpful. So yeah, it has to be 51% corn, produced in the United States. Can't be distilled over 80%, and it has to be used or aged in new charred oak barrels, and I believe it has to be rested for at least 3 months to be considered bourbon.
So when you say, I just got to point this out because I think this is something I found really interesting when I first started to learn about whiskey. When you say new charred oak barrels, there's a couple of things there. Obviously, oak barrels mean they're made out of oak trees.
Right.
Charred is interesting because I never really understood what that meant until I realized it means exactly what it sounds like, where they actually burn the insides of the barrel with fire.
Exactly.
And char the wood. I thought that was kind of crazy.
Yeah, so you're creating essentially like a charcoal in there. You're caramelizing a lot of sugars in the barrel, and that's where some of the vanilla qualities actually come from in your bourbon.
So that's why bourbon, and to be bourbon, it has to be aged in charred oak barrels, not just any old oak barrel.
And it has to be brand new.
And that's another point, is around the newness is which I think we learned about this when talking about some other spirits, that there are some other spirits that use old charred oak barrels for their aging because, frankly, there's so many of them because bourbon needs the new stuff.
Exactly. And that's typically the lifespan of a barrel. A lot of them will start off as bourbon barrels and then get distributed worldwide for other spirits. And it does retain a little bit of that bourbon flavor, but just because bourbon, to be classified as bourbon, you have to have new charred oak barrels, so there's just a surplus of them out there, and it's a really easy supply to pick up on the market.
Yeah, that's good to know. So if I need any new planters for our garden, I'm going to head down to Bourbon County.
Yeah, probably not.
Is charred oak good for the garden? I'm not sure.
Right. And there's different levels of charred. Well, I mean, you can get as crazy and as geeky as you want to as far as whiskey goes.
We'll probably do that later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I kind of took us down a path there. So we talked about bourbon, but what about rye?
So rye, in order to be classified as a rye whiskey, it just needs to be 51% rye wheat. Like you have rye bread, the same material as your starting base.
Are there any requirements on the barrels for that one?
No, I don't believe so. I think you can use just about... you can actually use used barrels for rye whiskey.
Ah, so they're probably using the used bourbon barrels then.
So you don't have that same kind of designation that you do have with bourbon.
But I'm sure different brands have their different choices, and there may be brands that choose to use new barrels because they prefer the flavor and things like that.
That can be one of those things that's just a signature flavor of that particular brand, too.
Right, so they have the flexibility there that bourbon does not.
Right. So the next kind of the pinnacle of the whiskey world is what is known as single malt Scotch.
This is kind of like the like XO cognac of whiskey, right?
It is, yeah, and you can spend a lot of money on single malt Scotches. It's not as expensive as some of the higher end cognacs out there. You're not going to be spending $2 million on your Scotch single malt Scotches, but you're going to be spending a lot of money if you get into Scotch single malt Scotches. And what single malt Scotch actually means is that it comes from malted grain, and the malt comes from a single distillery. So one of the most interesting things about single malt Scotches is that they're known by the region that they come from, and each region kind of has their own style. Mm-hmm. So like Islay Scotches is a big kind of powerful masculine style of Scotch. The Highland Scotch tends to be a little bit more floral, a little bit more honeyed. So each region kind of has their own identity as far as the style.
Yeah, and it seems like with Scotch, there absolutely is a subculture here. I had the opportunity to follow Chris to a Scotch tasting and was absolutely blown away by the incredible differences that you can taste between the different kinds of Scotch. And not only that, but the incredible geekiness of the people there and how much they knew.
It was
amazing.
Level. Yeah,
it was incredible. I was really impressed. I'm not going to lie. It was like Scotch and cigars. That was the room.
Oh, it's a match made in heaven right there.
Big time.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing.
But the thing about Scotch is it really is generally a sipping drink. You're not going to throw Scotch in a Coke. You may use, because of the higher cost, it doesn't usually make a lot of sense to use it behind the bar in a commercial setting, but you will sometimes see the really, really strongly flavored ones in a cocktail because you can use such a tiny amount that it does sort of get over that cost barrier. So I think I like Scotch was the one that had the really, really crazy.
It's extremely powerful, yeah, and it has this really kind of smoky quality. And kind of an iodine thing going on.
You can almost use that, like you could almost use a dash of that in a cocktail and really make a difference.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Even if you just wash out your glass with it and dump it out, you're going to notice it. I mean, it's a really powerful flavor and aroma as well.
So that's something that you do sometimes see. It's really quite rare, though. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're using whiskey in a cocktail in general, it's going to be whiskey, bourbon, or rye.
Typically, yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that, you could, but why do it if, it's $100 worth of product? It doesn't.
Well, I mean, if somebody gave it to you, go to town, right?
Exactly.
Unless I gave it to you, in which case I'll be offended.
So that pretty much touches on the major styles of cognac, of whiskey out there.
So I'm gonna before we move on beyond the common types, I want to just ask a couple key questions that people might be thinking in terms of like, okay, that's great and wonderful, whiskey, bourbon, rye, blah. What do I buy? Like, how do I actually use them in cocktails? So can you speak a little bit to the difference between bourbon, rye, and whiskey in terms of actual flavor?
Sure. So with whiskey, it's such a broad category that there's a lot of different profiles of whiskey, but typically if something is designated as whiskey and it doesn't have that bourbon or rye or single malt Scotch kind of designation to it, or even the Japanese styles, most likely it's probably a lot more mellow. It doesn't have a lot of barrel intensity to it. You're not going to taste a lot of tannins from the wood. It's just going to be a really, really soft and easy drinking whiskey. Like Jameson's would be a great example of just something that's very smooth, easy to drink, and
a good standby.
Yeah, absolutely. Now with bourbon and rye, typically what you get with bourbon as compared to rye is bourbon tends to be a little bit sweeter. So there's much more of a rich kind of mouthfeel. And with rye, you get much more of a dry and kind of a spicy note to it. I always kind of get a more of a vegetal kind of component. And anytime any spirit has a high rye content, I always taste peas. Not like
peas and corn?
Exactly, like peas.
Really?
Yeah.
You don't even like peas?
No, and that's why it stands out so much for me is because there's that vegetal component to it.
I have never noticed that, but Chris does have a really fantastic palate. So if you're ever drinking your rye and taste peas, you can thank him.
Yeah. So, and the interesting thing about bourbon and rye is because that it only has to have 51%, you can actually kind of cross over into different taste profiles. So, for example, a bourbon that has a high significant amount of rye to it will actually taste very close to a rye whiskey that has a very low percentage of rye, like 51%.
Ah, that makes sense. So you could have a rye whiskey that's right at 51% rye and a bourbon whiskey that's at like 48% rye.
And it could be very similar.
And
tasting.
they could share that flavor. That's good to know. So when you're shopping for, not to skip ahead a little bit, when you're shopping and walking down the aisle, do the labels typically say what they're made out of or how much time they spend in wood or any indicators of the flavor?
They can. Some of the higher end whiskeys and bourbons out there will definitely have a age designation. And definitely when you get into the single malt scotches, they want to really emphasize how much time is spent in barrels.
They're proud of it, yeah.
And there's a cost involved with that, with anything that's aged, for sure. But as far as costs go, if you're going to be spending money on a whiskey, you're probably going to be spending at least $20. And this is going to give you, a decent Irish whiskey or even, American whiskey. And, whiskey consumption over the last 5 years has really, really increased the price across the board for pretty much all whiskeys.
Seems like it's gotten really popular.
Yeah, it really has. And, there's it definitely part of that whole resurgence of classic cocktails out there. Whiskey was a major player back then, obviously. And, that's kind of what we're seeing in the market now. And one of the things to be careful of is because we are consuming so much whiskey that there is predictions of a whiskey shortage coming up. So
stock up now. Yikes.
Yeah, grab those coupons.
Yeah, really. Coupon? Do they don't go on
No,
sale?
Actually they do. Yeah.
Do they really?
Yeah.
Oh, good to know.
From time to time. But
grab your whiskey coupons.
If you are looking at a bourbon, you're probably going to be spending much more money than you are with just buying a whiskey. So typically bourbons start at around $25 and then go up as much as $3,000 is something I've seen recently. With,
throw that in your cocktail.
Yeah, exactly. But you can expect to spend about $25 to $30, and some decent brands to kind of look out for is Maker's Mark, Bulleit, and if you want something with a little bit more spice to it, like we talked about earlier, with a high rye content, Buffalo Trace is a fantastic bourbon to keep an eye out for, and it's definitely going to fall within that $25 to $30 range.
So if I just want to make a tasty Manhattan, what is it just a matter of preference between choosing a whiskey or choosing a bourbon or a rye? Is it just like what flavor do you like better?
Yeah, if you like a sweeter style cocktail, I would definitely start to gravitate towards like a Maker's Mark.
Got it.
But if you want something with a little bit of character and backbone and kind of that vegetal component, then I would probably kind of steer most people towards rye, which is how I love my Manhattans.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I do love my rye.
So one of the biggest and most consumed spirits recently that's really gone through a resurgence is actually rye. I remember over the last couple of years that even as a buyer for a beverage program, I had a really, really hard time tracking down a reliable source of rye. Every couple of months, my vendor would call me up and say, by the way, that rye that you're buying for your cocktail program, we're out.
Wow.
So, it
got popular before the supply could keep up, it sounds like.
Exactly. And it's something we're still noticing in the market now.
So are you going to pay more?
You're going to pay a little bit more for that. Well, not more than bourbon, but, you're going to be spending a little bit more than you would your normal whiskey. So a decent rye out there can spend about $20 to $30. And Bulleit rye is actually one of the ryes I really recommend. I think they do a great job with that.
I think that's what we're drinking right now, right?
It is, yeah. No, actually, we're drinking Bulleit regular bourbon right now.
Oh, not the rye.
Not the rye, but it's definitely my go-to choice as far as Manhattans go typically. We were just running a little bit low.
We're running low because it's our go-to choice.
So much, right? Exactly. But as far as like the bartender's choice, Rittenhouse is high upon that pedestal of decent ryes, and you can find that at a pretty good price of about $20 to $25. So if you find it on their store shelves, definitely pick up a bottle of that. You'll be pretty happy with that. Very, very spicy, very dry. It's got a great kind of rye profile. Now, if you're looking for a decent value on your rye whiskey, I would recommend trying a brand called Old Overhold. It kind of comes in at the bottom tier as far as the price goes, but in my opinion, they do a great job, and you can probably pick up a bottle of that for around $17 to $18. It's a really, really good value.
It's pretty specific.
Out there. Yeah.
$17.32.
$17.99.
Plus tax.
But they do a great job, and the quality of the product is really, really good. So that brings us on to what we're drinking. Obviously, we're drinking a Manhattan right now.
We kind of gave that one away.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's a really, really easy recipe, classic recipe. 2 parts of bourbon or rye to 1 part sweet vermouth and a couple dashes of bitters. And my sweet vermouth of choice is Carpano Antica. It's one of the higher-end sweet vermouths, but I think it does a really, really great job in Manhattans. So we'll have the recipe for you at mixologytalk.com/6.
Definitely check out that recipe. And before we go, though, on Manhattans, I think we ran out of Garnish on this one, right?
We did, yeah. And this there is a lot of flexibility as far as the garnish on a Manhattan. Traditionally, it's with a brandy cherry. Sometimes I prefer an orange twist to give it a little bit more of that kind of floral quality or richness.
I just prefer to eat an entire jar of brandy cherries.
And spend good money on your brandy
notice
cherries.
we did not say maraschino cherries.
Yeah.
Do not repeat after me. I will not use maraschino cherries in my Manhattan.
You never want to do that.
I don't mean to be that guy, but you just don't do that.
Yeah, you really want to spend money. Get good quality brandy cherries. They will make such a difference in your cocktails. I can't recommend them highly enough. So some other common cocktails that feature whiskey are old fashions, mint juleps, whiskey sours, and a boulevardier, which is kind of a take on a Negroni. So take out the gin, add bourbon to it. Essentially is what a
sounds
boulevardier.
Pretty good. I do love. I think these are all great cocktails. You, Chris, turned me on to the sort of brown liquors, and this has become just a huge favorite of mine. And I do love a whiskey sour.
I think it's one of those things that once you start to get educated in spirits and you start to develop a palate for other flavors, brown spirits you start to go down that road.
Definitely, yeah. But it can take some time to sort of ease into it. And one of the things that I learned earlier this year when we were writing a training course around spirits and designing cocktails, I actually learned that there's really a huge spectrum in terms of the intensity of whiskey in particular.
Yeah,
and so one of the things I thought was really interesting is that if you have somebody who doesn't like whiskey, but you're trying to sort of ease them into it, or you yourself don't like whiskey and you'd like to, you could start with one of these lighter types. Like I think Canadian whiskey tends to be a little bit lighter, right?
Canadian whiskey, Irish whiskey, yeah, they tend to be a little bit more of a light expression of whiskey. Just
Baby
because,
steps.
Exactly. They don't have as much oak contact. As bourbons and ryes do. So
that makes sense,
it mutes down that intensity a lot.
Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up our spirit series. I hope that you found this useful. Obviously, we didn't talk about everything you'll ever find behind the bar, but this is just episode number 6. There's a lot more coming. So if you have a particular topic that you'd like us to talk about, or a spirit or an ingredient that you'd like to learn more about, leave us a question. There's a link to do that over at mixologytalk.com/6. And what's coming next week, Chris?
So next week, I'm really excited because the biggest event for bartenders and cocktail creators, mixologists, whatever you want to call them, is happening next week. And we're going to New Orleans. We're going to be doing podcasts live at an event called Tales of the Cocktail.
Not quite live. We'll probably be publishing the next day. We'll get it as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's the best and biggest event in the bar community, and 30,000 people kind of descend upon New Orleans and just have a week-long celebration of bartenders, cocktails, and spirits.
Definitely. And so we're going to be bringing you a daily wrap-up of what's going on, what we're learning, and hopefully a couple chats with the people that we're meeting along the way.
Yeah, so if you're going to Tales, let us know. And definitely send us an email at cheers@abarabove.com. And let's see if we can meet up at Tales.
That would be great. We would love to meet you if you're there. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Until next time.
Cheers.
Cheers. Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.